And are you seeing just the main slide, or are you seeing the side? I don't know.
We could see kind of everything. We see the main slide, but also like the header.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm very happy to be here with you again. I was just reminded that I was here last year talking about the Underground Railroad and New Jersey's involvement in the Underground Railroad. And I enjoyed my time with you immensely. So I was very happy to be asked to come back this year to talk about one of my favorite historical figures, Ona Judge Staines, whose wish for freedom and her successful efforts in making that wish come true have been widely discussed over the past few years with the publication of a book, Never Caught, by Rutgers professor Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. But I actually met the daring and intelligent Ona Judge Staines while a graduate student at Drew University exactly 20 years ago. I was researching for a paper for a course on George Washington and his position on slavery. And I had made up my mind when I entered the graduate program that I, whenever possible, would write papers that brought to the surface voices of the unheards. And I was going to focus my paper on George Washington and his relationship with his cook, Hercules, who was also an enslaved person, and Hercules' fight to freedom, when I stumbled on the name Ona Judge Staines, a name that I had never heard of before. So when I did hear of her, she took over my life that summer of 2001, for we are never too old to be touched by heroic individuals, and she certainly became that for me. And it was at a time when there was very little printed about her. I was combing dusty archives of libraries in New York and in Washington trying to find information. Perhaps the journey of Ona took on a special or a significant meaning for me because I had had the wonderful experience of attending an all-girls high school, which I didn't think was so wonderful at the time. A women's college, which I also didn't think was such a wonderful thing at the time. But I was in those two institutions at the height of the women's movement. And also was an influence was a mother who repeated the story of her taking a leap towards a kind of freedom in her youth. It's probably all those things that made Ona's experience resonate with me. So hopefully after this evening, she will hold a special place in your memory bank as well. Yeah. Trying to get my slide to move and it won't. Let's see. Be patient with me. I wonder why it's not. Still not going. Oh, and now it's going too fast. I am sorry. Be patient with me. Let me just go through the whole thing and try and go back to the beginning. Okay. You're going to have to leave the navigator on, I think. So we are not slaves of the past, nor servants of the present, but masters of the future. That was taken from Rise of the Morning Star by A.J. Darkholme, and it's the first book in the self-help fantasy series, The Morning Star Chronicles. It is the story of a man whose life is not going how he once thought it would. He works hard, but it seems like no matter how hard he works or how good he is, things just do not go his way. At his breaking point, he goes all for broke and starts taking back control of his life, soon realizing the power of his choices. But those choices do not come without consequences. The more he changes things and starts to manipulate the people around him, the more it begins to change him as well. So keep these words in mind as we progress through my remarks, which are the story of a woman, Ona Judge, whose life is not how she thought it should be. She works hard, but it seems like no matter how hard she works, things just do not go her way. She goes for broke and starts to take control of her life, soon realizing the power of her choices and the changes that choice brings. There are consequences. The more she changes and starts to manipulate the people around her, the more it begins to change her as well. But I feel I have to say a few words about the lives of two other enslaved women who you are probably more familiar with, but who lived within Ona's lifetime. The first is Phyllis Wheatley, born in 1753, died in 1784. And the second is Harriet Tubman, born in 1820 and died in 1913. Now, Ona Judge lived between 1773 and 1848. She was 20 years old when Miss Wheatley died, and interviews about her were widely spread. Miss Wheatley was a poet and perhaps the first woman poet to have a book published, but more certainly the first woman of African descent to have a volume of poetry published. And she wrote a poem to George Washington and was invited to have an audience with him, which she did. Now, Martha Washington and Ona, as her servant, traveled frequently with George Washington pre and post the American Revolution. She could have been present when the president visited, when Phyllis Wheatley came to visit the president. The two great women, the first women of African descent I heard of, served as the bookends of Ona's life. Did Ona know of Phyllis? Well, I'm pretty sure she did, because Phyllis had a wide-reaching network. And as I mentioned, that she had more than one personal audience with George Washington, and certainly Martha would have been there. She was the poster woman, Phyllis that is, for what might be possible if Africans were looked upon and treated as equal humans. Herself enslaved, Phyllis Wheatley used her poetry to fight against the inequality encouraged by slavery. Initially, her poetry was regarded as a threat to the conventional styles of society. However, with time, anti-slavery proponents were beginning to use Wheatley to prove that no race was superior to another. Phyllis wrote, "Through thickest gloom, look back, immortal shade, on that confusion which thy death has made. In every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is important, it is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance." That's Phyllis on the left. Ona gave her first public interviews about her life, free and post-freedom, after Frederick Douglass wrote the abolitionist paper, The North Star, and Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad activities were brought to public attention through the North Star and other publications circulating in the New England area. I cannot say definitively yes, but Ona was living when Harriet was a wanted woman and an outspoken abolitionist when Ona gave her interviews towards the end of her life. Phyllis traveled through the New England states where Ona was living. Was Ona encouraged to tell her story after Harriet went public? Well, perhaps. We know minds are often changed by public events, and Ona was very much like Harriet, and as Harriet said, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. And hence, Harriet took her freedom as Ona would do as well. Okay. So we're going to talk a bit about life in Mount Vernon. As we all know, slavery operated as the standard very early in the formation of the American colonies. 1619 is a symbolic date of the beginning of the institutionalization of slavery in what would become the United States. It was 1619 when a Dutch ship brought 20 African slaves ashore in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, or as we know right now, really Port Comfort, which is really closer to Hampton, Virginia. Throughout the 17th century, European settlers in North America turned to African enslaved people as a cheaper, more plentiful labor source than indentured servants, who were mostly poor Europeans and whose servitude was short-term. Though it is impossible to give accurate figures, some historians have estimated that 6 to 7 million African slaves were imported to North America during the 18th century alone, depriving the African continent of some of its healthiest and ablest men and women. Hence, we had the successful colonization of the African continent, which is another discussion for another time. But again, in the 17th and 18th centuries, African slaves worked mainly on the tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the southeastern coast, from the Chesapeake Bay colonies of Maryland and Virginia south to Georgia. But do not mistake slavery as strictly a Southern institution. Slaves were in every state, including New Jersey. New Jersey was the last northern state to abolish the institution of slavery. This is the abolishment of slavery in New Jersey did not occur until after the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1868, 3 years after the conclusion of the Civil War. At the end of the war, according to historian James DiCantano in his book, Slavery and Freedom in New Jersey, there were nearly 800 people who were enslaved in the Garden State, at the conclusion of the war. After the American Revolution, many colonists, particularly in the North, began to link the oppression of African slaves to their own oppression by the British and to call for slavery's abolition. You might know that one of the first martyrs to the cause of American patriotism was Crispus Addicts. This is an artist rendering of what he might have looked like, who was a runaway slave who was killed by British soldiers during the Boston Massacre of 1770. Some 5,000 Black soldiers and sailors fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War. But after the war, the new United States Constitution tacitly acknowledged the institution of slavery, counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of taxation and representation in Congress, and guaranteeing the right to repossess any person held to service or labor, an obvious euphemism for slavery. Although slavery was never as widespread in the North as in the South, many in the North grew rich on the slave trade and investments in Southern plantations. Our own cities of Camden, Patterson, Jersey City, and first and foremost Newark grew rich off slavery and the slave trade, for they provided equipment for the implementation and the proliferation of the trade and from the production of luxury items demanded by those who grew rich as a result of slavery. This is a picture of a home in Newark on Warren Street, for any of you who know where that is, that served as an Underground Railroad station. If you know the campus of Rutgers Newark, this house sat right where the athletic field of that campus sits now. While many abolitionists based their activism on the belief that slaveholding was a sin, others were more inclined to the non-religious free labor argument, which held that slaveholding was regressive, inefficient, and made little economic sense. Free Blacks and other anti-slavery Northerners had begun helping fugitive slaves escape from Southern plantations to the North via a loose network of safe houses as early as the 1780s. This practice, again known as the Underground Railroad, gained real momentum in the 1830s. And although estimates vary widely, it may have helped anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 slaves reach freedom. It was certainly used by Ona Judge, who was assisted in her escape while living in Philadelphia by the network of freed Black men in that city who formed the Underground Railroad. And I'm sure that probably many of you who are here with us this evening saw the movie Harriet. It's currently running on HBO. And you know that Philadelphia was really a hotbed of Underground Railroad activity, and so was New Jersey. So let's talk a little bit more about Ona Judge. In her first newspaper interview printed in the Granite Freeman of Concord, New Hampshire on May 22nd, 1845, Ona Judge was asked if she regretted her escape. She replied, "No, I am free and have, I trust, been made a child of God by that means." Perhaps some of you have been to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and I believe it is the street level where the inaugural gowns of the First Lady are on display. This is, again, I'm sure you recognize as George and Martha Washington. Those gowns just show how intricate the clothing was in those days, and Martha Washington's gown is there on display. She was a short but stout woman. Martha's gown was quite intricate, and ladies of the day wore multiple layers of clothing, including corsets and pantaloons. Remember, this is the day before sewing machines, so all garments would have been hand sewn. All garments of a woman of Martha's class would have been dressed to perfection on a daily basis. It would have been Easter Sunday every day. Ona Judge would have been responsible for keeping Martha's wardrobe in pristine shape. Martha was really known for her patriotism and love of country. This is Mount Vernon, the home of George and Martha Washington. She is known for traveling to winter camps to be with her husband and to have played an integral part in shaping his ideas and in perfecting the personality of the man we would learn about from the earliest days of our schooling. She was in Morristown with Washington. She was in Elizabeth with Washington. She was in Newark with Washington. She lived with him as First Lady in New York City and in Philadelphia. And Ona Judge, as her personal slave since the age of 10, would have been with her, would have been by her side at all times, as all ladies' maids were. She would have been by her side during Martha's frequent teas. She would have known her most intimate friends and their thoughts. What did Martha know about Ona and the other enslaved persons who worked in the Washington household? Next to nothing but their worth as a servant. So this is a picture of, this painting hangs in the trustee boardroom of Yale University. It is of Elihu Yale, his friends, and his family. And Mr. Yale, as you can guess, was a major benefactor of what we know of today as Yale University. He is standing center with the group of men holding the pipe. And perhaps some of you know the artist Titus Caffor. He's a Yale Masters of Fine Arts graduate and an artist who specializes in bringing the hidden story into view. So if you look at this painting, you see Mr. Yale and his friends front and center. And in the background, you see women and children probably playing. And if you look closely to the bottom right of the painting, you'll see a young child with carrying the bottle of probably Madeira, which was the favorite drink of the day, and probably supplies for Mr. Yale and his friend. You see they're smoking a pipe and they're drinking Madeira, as men of means were known to do. And I mentioned Titus Caffor, the artist. This is his take on the previous picture. And his take is called Enough About You. And he simply takes Mr. Yale and all of his other people and crumples them up, but highlights for you a portrait of the child. And if you look closely in this photo, and you probably can't see it, that he has around his neck a collar with a lock on it, right? And Mr. Caffor feels that if George Washington crossing the Delaware matters, so must his ruthless pursuit of the runaway Ona Judge. If he was crossing the Delaware on a fight for freedom, and that was important to him, how do we explain the contradiction of his 30-year, actually 50-year pursuit, if you count his family's pursuit, of this runaway woman, Ona Judge, who simply wanted her freedom? And by the way, the title, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, of Titus Caffor's painting is called Enough About You. It must have been a great shock to Martha and George Washington when Ona Judge took her freedom on May 21st, 1796, while the household of President George Washington was stationed in Philadelphia. They were in the midst of perhaps preparing a retreat to Mount Vernon for the summer. Judge prepared her escape. She simply walked out of the house while the family was eating dinner. And her motivation was clear: complete freedom from slavery. Now, this is an image of one of the homes that Washington lived in while Philadelphia was the temporary capital of the United States. I'm not quite sure whether this is the home. I think they lived in a total of 3 while in Philadelphia, so I'm not quite sure if this is the one, but this is certainly one of them. As I might have mentioned before, Judge was born at Mount Vernon around 1773, and she was the daughter of dower slave Betty and European American indentured servant and tailor Andrew Judge. So her mother was an African slave. I believe she was mulatto. And her father was a Scotsman, I believe, Andrew Judge, so he was European. Like her mother, Betty, Ona was a skilled seamstress, and by her own account, was never taught to read or write while living at Mount Vernon, nor was she exposed to any religion. At the age of 10, Judge was incorporated into Mount Vernon's labor force. So her childhood lasted for 10 years. And as part of the labor force working in the mansion, she was always a favorite of Martha Washington's. And Judge was one of the handful of slaves brought by George and Martha Washington to live in New York with them in 1789, when New York was the temporary capital of the United States, and then to Philadelphia in 1790 at the start of his presidency. However, she was never kept in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months at a time. To avoid establishing a legal residency that under Pennsylvania law and Act for Gradual Abolition of Slavery that was passed in 1780s, she would be free from her enslavement. The law simply cited that if you were an enslaved person and you lived in the city of Philadelphia for 6 consecutive months, you could petition to be set free. Once enslaved people found out about this, they would often run away and petition for their freedom, which they received. Again, I think that was repeated in the movie Harriet as well. But Washington, when he found out about this, would circulate his slaves. So he would bring them to Philadelphia. They'd stay there for 5.5 months. He'd ship them back to Monticello or take them on a trip to New York City with him so that they would be ineligible to apply for freedom. So much is known of Judge's life in comparison to Washington's other slaves as a result of newspaper interviews that she gave in 1845 and 1847 when she was free, as well as newspaper ads that were a result of George Washington's frustrated attempts to recapture her. This is one of those newspaper ads, which I know that you cannot read, but just take my word for it, that's one of them. Judge's escape from the mansion in Philadelphia was most likely inspired and facilitated by her exposure to free Blacks in Philadelphia and the fervent abolitionist spirit that was there. Her motivation was clear. She just wanted complete freedom from slavery. Judge had learned that she would be given to Elizabeth Parks Custis upon Martha Washington's death. The promise of continued enslavement, even after the Washington's death, cemented Judge's decision to risk her relatively comfortable position with the family and board a ship to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, as Martha's handmaid, she would have slept in the house, probably in a room or right next door to Martha's, or even in Martha's room at her bedside. She would have worn nice clothing because she would have been seen by the public often. She would have eaten, maybe not quite as well as the Washingtons, but she would have eaten fairly well during that time. She was leading, for an enslaved person, a relative life of comfort. But there's a difference in living in the house and being a house servant, and that is you were under watch 24/7. There's hardly ever a time where you were alone for more than 10 or 15 minutes every 24-hour day. When Ona ran away back in Philadelphia, Mrs. Washington felt betrayed and claimed that Ona must have been abducted and seduced by a Frenchman. She wrote, Mrs. Washington that is, that Ona had always been well treated and even had a room of her own. The First Lady urged the president to advertise a reward for Ona's recapture. But Washington refused, realizing how unpopular that would be. After all, he was the president, and if the president's slave was so discontent that she had to run away, out the window goes all the theories about happy, docile slaves and how slavery is really good for them. Ona was in Philadelphia for over a month before she left the city by boat. Where she stayed, how she booked passage, how she made contacts in New Hampshire, who helped her both on the ship in the city of Philadelphia and in New Hampshire is really not known. Later that same summer that she ran away, Elizabeth Langdon, daughter of Senator John Langdon of New Hampshire, spotted Ona walking on a street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Elizabeth was one of the Washington's granddaughter Nellie's closest friends and a frequent visitor to the president's house, and reportedly a classmate of the president's grandchildren at an Annapolis finishing school. Ona avoided Nellie's friend, but either Elizabeth or her father wrote to Washington telling him that Ona could be found in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Washington asked Secretary of the Treasurer Oliver Wolcott to handle the matter, and the latter wrote to Joseph Whipple, the collector of customs of Portsmouth, requesting his help in the return of the president's wife's property, Ona Judge. Whipple made an attempt of complying with what must have seemed like an intimidating order, but warned in a letter that abducting the girl and placing her on a ship headed south might cause a riot on the docks, because New Hampshire at that time was the center of abolitionist activity. Whipple did find Ona and interrogated her, and reported back to Walcott that after a cautious examination, it appeared to me that she had not been decoyed away by a Frenchman, um, uh, but that she had this thirst for complete freedom, which she was informed would take place on her arrival in Portsmouth and Boston, and that had been her only motive for running away. Scared, lonely, and miserable, Ona tried to negotiate through Whipple. She offered to return to the Washingtons, but only if she would be guaranteed freedom upon their deaths. An indignant president responded in person to Whipple's letter. To enter, he said, quote, to enter into such a compromise with her, as she suggested to you, is totally inadmissible. It would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with the premature preference of freedom, and therefore discontent beforehand the minds of all of her fellow servants, who by their steady attachment and faithfulness are more deserving than freedom than she is. And they're more deserving because they did not try and run away. 2 years later, Washington's nephew, Burnwell Bassett Jr., traveled to New Hampshire on business, and he was entertained by the Langdons. And again, this is the Langdon house. And over dinner, mentioned that one of the things he had hoped to accomplish during his trip was the recapture of Ona Judge. This time, the Langdons helped Ona. Again, they were caught up in the abolitionist fervor, who was now married to a sailor named Jack Staines, and the mother of a child. Word was sent to her for her family to immediately go into hiding, and Bassett returned to Virginia without Ona. So let me make it clear. The Langdons at this time, instead of helping Washington, really helped Ona, got word to her that someone is after you, and with his help and with the help of others, put her in hiding. Now, her life, Ona's life as a free woman, was difficult. Her husband died after only 7 years of marriage. He left her poor with 3 small children. She outlived 2 of them. Her only son joined the Navy and was never seen again. She was forced to live on public assistance and with other people without the fine dresses and fancy foods that she was accustomed to as the favorite personal slave of Martha Washington. On May 22nd of 1845, Judge was asked if she regretted her escape. She replied, "No, I am free and have, I trust, been made a child of God by the means." Meaning she was introduced to the Bible and she took pride in learning how to read and write, and was hence introduced to religion and found her faith in God. On 2 separate occasions, Judge was confronted by George Washington's aides and to return to Mount Vernon, free of punishment, but she refused, as she was still not guaranteed freedom after the deaths of George and Martha Washington. George was offended by Judge's willingness to bargain with his aides and concluded that her disloyalty and ingratitude in running away should never be condoned by giving in to such demands. Afraid of being returned to her owners, Judge lived a shadowy life that was isolated and clandestine. For almost 50 years, the fugitive slave woman kept to herself, building a family and a new life upon the quicksand of her legal enslavement. She lived most of her time as a fugitive in Greenland, New Hampshire, a tiny community just outside the city of Portsmouth. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which Washington signed into law in Philadelphia, probably in his private office barely a dozen feet from where Ona slept, She lived the rest of her life as a fugitive. Ona Judge Staines died in Greenland, New Hampshire on February 25th, 1848, at the age of 75. Attesting to the absurdities of the legal status of slaves at the time of her death, Ona Judge was still not legally a free person. She is not mentioned in Washington's 1799 will, where he freed his slaves upon the death of Martha Washington. Ona and her children, though they were born in New Hampshire, the children that is, remained property of the Custis estate. Her freedom was freedom in mind, not freedom of her physical being. And with the difficult life that mental freedom brought, it was still preferable to living a more than physically comfortable life as a slave. Ona, her children, because they were born of a mother who was still a slave, were also enslaved. So they were born into slavery, although born in New Hampshire, and they died as slaves, as did Ona. Frederick Douglass said, "I have often been asked how I felt when I first found myself on free soil, and my readers may share the same curiosity. There is scarcely anything in my experience about which I could not give a more satisfactory answer," he stated. "A new world had opened upon me. If life is more than breath and the quick round of blood, I have lived more in one day than in a year of my slave life. It was a time of joyous excitement which words can but tamely describe." In a letter written to a friend soon after reaching New York, Douglass said, "I felt as one might feel upon escape from a den of hungry lions. Anguish and grief, like darkness and rain, may be depicted, but gladness and joy, like the rainbow, defy the skill of pen and pencil." End of quote. Ona Judge and Frederick Douglass were in physical bondage. They actually achieved their freedom long before they dared to take physical flight. They freed themselves mentally first, and in both cases, carefully calculated how to obtain their physical freedom. With Douglass, learning of power through the written word as taught to him by his master's wife was the beginning of his understanding of the power of freedom. For Judge, it was living among freed Blacks in New York and Philadelphia that were the catalyst for her understanding of what freedom could mean. They thought, they calculated, they prayed, they risked, they confided in those that were free to attain their freedom. They knew there was no going back, no matter the cost. We are all acquainted with the atrocities of slavery. We have read enough articles or books, or seen enough movies or TV shows that let us know of the physical violence and the mental damage done to the enslaved. What we often fail to think about is that slavery was, of course, not good for the enslaved. But have we stopped to think about what the institution of slavery, and although less harsh, but certainly an institution that has led to some of the complex psychological issues that still plague 21st century American culture, is what the undermining, confining, psychological, and physical beating of women and those who are considered the dregs of society has done to the American psyche as a whole. It has become acceptable to belittle and to ill-treat the so-called least of us. We hear of the psychological profile of assassins as a reason for their treacherous acts. What have we done to create such behavior? More important, what have we done that we turn a deaf ear to victims of the new Jim Crow, of the mentally disturbed, of the harassed and bullied? We know, or at least we think we know, of the psychological type that perpetuates these crimes. Why are we silent? We know the effects of poverty, of the hurt multiple generations of the disenfranchised have felt, and why their dreams often explode into violence. I like to believe that you in this room were born physically free, but I too have experienced my doubt or worth as a person, as I'm sure many of you have at certain times in life. Although fairly intelligent and likable, there have been times, and I can remember how terrible it feels to be considered less than. It's not good. But I have been fortunate enough to have not lived one day of my 70 years without knowing love in my life. That is not my history. My past is one of knowing poverty and hard times and heartache, but also knowing love. That history of love shaped my past, influences my present, and the future of my children. My psychological freedom has always been intact. But if for many that is not the case, as William Faulkner once said, the past is never dead. It is not even the past. And for far too many in our society, that feeling less than is the present, and it will always be in the present for them. So let us all be diligent in assuring, in whatever tools we have in our possession, understanding the power of love, understanding the power of freedom, and do all that we can do to pass that power on to all we meet. We are not slaves as the past. I'm going back to Rise of the Morning Star, nor servants of the present, but masters of the future. And our individual and collective future, let us remember the words of Jimi Hendrix: when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. While we may feel safe or comfortable in our small and structured world, to stop changing is to stop growing. Don't hesitate to change. Learning to let go of the things we know can lead to a bigger and a better world. Stepping into a brand new path is difficult, but not more difficult than remaining in a situation which is not nurturing for yourself or to others. So that's the story of Ona Judge, and a little of my preaching at the end for you. Hopefully you've learned something from it. What I might not have made perfectly clear is that Ona was actually, her family really belonged to Martha. And when Martha died and when George died, those people who were her slaves, if they were not freed upon their will, would have been the slaves of their relatives. So it was really for 50 years, from the age of her early 20s until her death at 75, that Ona was an enslaved woman, and she was pursued as such and remained such all of her life. As I said, she died after her children, but her children again were enslaved when they died. Her son was a seaman and was either lost at sea or just dared never return to Portsmouth, because we don't know what happened to him. But I'm going to assume that he remained an enslaved person who was a fugitive all of his life as well. So I don't know if any of you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them. I haven't looked at the chat, so I don't know what's there. And I will go back and I guess can leave the first picture of Ona up.
Well, thank you so much. So far, I'm looking in the chat. So Trish asks, how did Washington treat his slaves? Was he abusive?
I don't, first of all, the institution of slavery was abusive for anyone who was enslaved. And it had to be to get people to do, which it was either physically abusive or mentally abusive, or in most cases, both. Ona was not the only one of his enslaved people that ran away. I mentioned in my opening remarks that there was Hercules, and there were also others who ran away not only from Philadelphia and New York, but from Mount Vernon as well. So I can't say that I have direct evidence of him being willfully and purposely abusive, but the institution of slavery itself encourages abusive behavior. I hope that answers the question.
I think so.
Okay.
Shakira asks, can you speak to the differences between abolitionists and anti-slave advocates? And then she says, excellent presentation. Thank you for introducing us to Ona.
Oh, and I forgot to say that if the book Never Caught is in paperback these days, there is also a children's edition of it. So the original by Eric Armstrong Dunbar was written for adults, but there is a children's version of the book Never Caught as well. But even the adult edition, even though it's a nonfiction book, is very, very easy to read. It reads just like a novel. So I would suggest it for any of you. I don't know if you have it in your library.
Yes, I just looked it up. We have the kids edition and the adult edition.
So I would encourage you to take out the book and to read it on your own. I couldn't cover the entire book in the time period that I have, but it's worth reading. You'll learn a good deal about it. And now I'm sorry, I was supposed to talk about the difference between abolitionism and anti-slavery.
And anti-slavery advocates.
I think they're pretty much the same, except that they're just like there are people who believe in peace. There are many variations of people who believed in abolition. Some believed in the abolition of slavery, but transportation of people who were of African descent back to the African continent, and felt that there was no place for them here in the United States. Of course, those who were born and raised here, even though they were enslaved, felt no affinity with the continent of Africa. They had never lived there. Chances are the parents had never lived there. So they were, for the most part, against the Back to Africa movement that was in vogue during that time by many anti-slavery advocates. There were also those who called for separate but unequal lives. So, okay, so you don't have to be a slave, but we also do not think that you are equal as human beings, so that you should not be allowed to have what white people have. That's a different kind of abolitionist. Yeah, okay, you shouldn't be enslaved, but then you're not equal with us either, so you shouldn't be equal. So I think that there's just a whole host of differences within your definition of abolitionism and in your definition of being anti-slavery. It doesn't mean that if you were either one of them, that you were truly this wonderful person who believed in full emancipation for people of color.
I think that was an excellent answer. We also have Virginia asks, do you believe that the 14th Amendment will ever really be valid to all citizens? I think she means the 13th Amendment.
Well, I'd like to think so. And I thought that we took a step further in 2020 with George Floyd and the protests. I was actually feeling a little bit better when I saw the diversity of the protesters, and we seem to have reached a different understanding about police brutality and the inequality of this society. So I'm an optimist by nature and optimistic that one day we will get there. I don't think it's going to be within my lifetime, considering what happened in Charlottesville and what happened in Washington, D.C. during the month of January, on January 6th. I don't think it's going to be during my lifetime, but I have hope that somewhere along the line it is going to happen, as I see more and more diverse groups of people calling for equal rights for all people. I'm going to be optimistic and say it will happen. Again, not in the next 20 or 30 years that hopefully I have left on this earth, but certainly I think eventually it's going to happen. If for no other reason, we have more, I think, legal interracial relationships than probably we have ever had before in our society. And that alone, I think, is going to bring us together more so than it has in the past, because we're now spending our holidays together. Mixed race couples are having children that have maybe in-laws and parents and aunts and uncles and cousins that are all mixed race. So I think that that will bring about a greater understanding of, no matter what color the outside of your skin might be, that we are equal on the inside, and it's the inside that counts.
And Jasmine asks, did George Washington pursue the other escaped slaves or just Ona? He seems to feel that she should be grateful and is upset by her lack of loyalty. His pursuit of her is personal.
Yeah, I think it was personal for Martha more than George, although it could have been personal for him too, because here she was, they considered a gift that they were giving her the best of what they could possibly give their enslaved people. So it really was a personal affront, that this is the person who lives in the house with us, is with us all the time, lives better than most people, white or black. How could she do this? But they had no understanding of freedom of the mind, no understanding of that this person might want to marry and to have children of her own, to have a family of her own. Marriage, again, was forbidden in slavery. There's so many things that slaves could not do or could not have that free people could have. And I think that they just did not understand this. And they did take it as a personal affront to their kindness and to their goodness. And you can see in the quote that I gave, his feeling that, well, she doesn't deserve to be free. There are people who deserve freedom more than she does. Well, you know, we all deserve freedom. We all deserve freedom. And that he could not see that leads me to think, if he couldn't see it for her, leads me to think that he couldn't see it for others either. I haven't done any research on how he treated most of his slaves. We hear about Mr. Lee, or the enslaved person Lee, who was with him from the time of the French and Indian War till he became president. And he eventually did give him his freedom, but only after he was thrown by a horse and was so crippled that he could no longer serve him. So, you know, he might not have been the worst of slave masters, but he certainly wasn't among the best either.
And these are going to be the last two questions, and they're kind of both related. So Marley and Nate and Dawn asks, was Ona's husband a free person? And Dawn asks, what were Ona's kids' names?
I don't know her children's names. I think they are in the Dunbar book, but I have no idea what they are. I can't remember. I believe that Staines was free, although I'm not 100% sure of that, but I believe that he was a free man. Again, he died 7 years into the marriage. But you also have to remember that if you were free and you were a person of African descent during that time, life was not easy for you, because what kind of work was there for you to do? People who had farms, and again, even in New Jersey and even in the North, had labor that was much cheaper. It was basically free labor. And so you would not pay much for anyone else to work with you. And Ona in particular was really, you know, she was suited as a seamstress. How many dresses could she make by hand? So her life before she took her freedom did not really prepare her for a life of freedom. There was not much that she could do to earn a living. She could have been a housekeeper, but then, you know, how many people were in a position to hire housekeepers during that time? And if you had them, they basically lived in your house and led a life, you know, where they were, if not enslaved, pretty much close to it. People were not accustomed to paying wages to people of color during that time. So I think the question was, you know, what were the names, which I don't know, and if her husband was free. And I think he was a free man, but I'm not at all positive. I don't want you to find out and say that I lied to you, but I think he was free, but I'm not absolutely sure. I should add that the two girls that she had that we know predeceased her died from diseases of poverty. Starvation, malnutrition, They both died during a flu season where they did not have the good health or the wherewithal to fight off a flu or a bad cold. So they died, they lived under horrid conditions. And she was living from pillar to post, always running away, trying to escape from being caught. But again, she said that it was better living that way than living under slavery. So they died relatively young, and both of them again died from diseases that could have been prevented had they been living a better life.
Okay. One last question from Virginia. I understand that his wooden teeth, I guess George Washington, is a myth. He actually pulled the teeth out of his slave's mouth to make out his dentures. True?
Well, I did hear that his dentures were made from the teeth of his slaves. Yes. That he died, he probably had 1 or 2 teeth left in his mouth at the time of his death.
Wow.
And I think his dentures are on display at the Smithsonian as well. I think I remember seeing that.
Well, that's crazy. Well, but thank you so much, Dr. Epps, for coming out tonight and speaking to my library. We appreciate it. In the chat, along with the questions, a lot of people just thanking you for coming out and doing this presentation and enlightening us on, a big part of history that I don't think anybody has ever heard of. So thank you.
Again, and that's, I think, what we're charged to do in this time period, and that is to try and find those unheard voices that we know so little about. For so long, we knew American history through great men, maybe a few women, but basically from the great men, the war generals and people and presidents and people like that. But it takes more than that to make up a world, to make up a society. So whenever possible, I try and find out information about those unknown voices and share them with you.
Well, thank you. It is very, very appreciated. And thank you all for coming to tonight's presentation again. We appreciated the questions and the interaction, and I hope everyone learned something. And have a great night. And again, check our calendars for more events coming up. We have a lot of stuff scheduled for March. And thank you so much.